I'm enjoying this. This is great. Thank you so much, Jim, for that wonderful, generous introduction. We were very young when we met. I think we're still young. We're still looking young. But, you know, gray hairs now. I keep mine to my chin. But we had a good time. You know, we were very young then. We were very bold. We were doing great things and having conversations that our seniors thought we were crazy, actually, at that time. And here we are. Thank you all for having me this afternoon. I see many familiar faces and friends. Neil, thank you for the official letter, actually, inviting me to give this talk. And I see Emily somewhere over there as well, and many of you in the room that I've known for years and years. So it's a great pleasure for me to join you this afternoon. I will start my talk this afternoon by paying homage to Professor Oyo Empire, whose work will always be a reference point to anyone interested in the question of community building, governance, and emergent social formations. I understand the risk of standing in this room as a guest and trying to make cursory remarks about Professor Vansina's vast body of scholarship. But I will take the risk anyway, hopefully for the sake of the undergraduates among us, as well as maybe first-year graduate students. Professor Vansina, I will argue, was preoccupied with one central question that eventually became the title of one of his last books: How Are Societies Born? From kingdoms of the savannah and the children of wood to paths in the rainforest and how societies are born, governance in West Central Africa before 1600. Professor Vansina's fieldwork and interdisciplinary quest for deep-time African history was about uncovering the rhizomatic processes of social formations in Central Africa. He was most famous for his breakthrough interdisciplinary historical methodology, but we should not forget that his interest in methodology derived from his ultimate quest to tell the story of Africa's processes of self-organizing, the epistemology of those processes, and the forms they took. Given my own interest in the history of social emergence and community building at different scales, from the household to the city to empire to the Yoruba as a cultural progress, Professor Vansina's work has always been a model on how to research, think, and write about different communities of praxis, what he called societies. So I'm therefore honored by your invitation to serve as a speaker in a lecture series that you have named in his honor. This titanic figure. Thank you. My talk is about the formation and dissolution of the Oyo Empire. The topic is not new, but my intervention here this afternoon is to explore this topic from the angle of what I call recovery. Just in case, what I'm going to say in the next 40 minutes, you miss everything. My argument is very simple. My argument is that the Oyo Empire was a product of recovery from the ecological and political instability that swept across West Africa from the late 14th century to the mid-16th century. However, the challenges it recovered from and its strategies of recovery were also the sources of its demise. It's a simple argument which responds to, I would say, about 80 years of historiography that has been stuck since 1977. From Samuel Johnson to Robin Law and Adeobayemi and others in between. In Central Sudan, the area we call Central Sudan. Okay, let me back up. Let me begin the story this way. The story I'm going to tell is about West Africa, what I call the West African crisis. In a span of about 70 years, between 1380 and 1450, the three megastates that had anchored the political landscape of Western Africa in the previous 2 centuries suffered significant setbacks. In Central Sudan, the political leaders of Kanem were embroiled, as we know, in internal conflicts and external attacks that forced them to move their capital from Njimi to Bono in 1387. But even there, they were beset with crises that did not abate until the third quarter of the 15th century. In Western Sudan, on the other side, the Mali Empire began the process of contraction in about the same period, 1380, following intra-elite conflicts and the southward push of the Tuareg pastoralists who have been displaced from their desert-hedged homes by recurring droughts. By 1450, Mali was no longer the multi-ethnic and multicultural empire it once was. It was basically a mandate state, as several scholars have noted. Now, going south, below River Niger, in the lower western Niger, the Ife Empire unraveled as well between 1380 and 1420. And the political integrity of that empire was effectively gone by 1450. Several principalities that were in the orbit of Ife Empire, like Oyo Kingdom, they suffered serious, displacement. These political misfortunes have been explained mostly in terms of intergroup conflicts, power politics, succession disputes, maybe the empire fatigue as well. Economic decline has also been invoked as one of the reasons for these collapses. What has been missing in these riveting stories of atrophy, collapse, and displacement is the ecological crisis associated with the recurrent drought episodes and unstable rainfall that became noticeable towards the end of the 14th century, especially between 1380 and 1420. We now have several lines of proxy evidence, ecological, palynology, and archaeobotany, all pointing to the ecological crisis associated with the Little Ice Age in West Africa. An important study in this regard is the work of Shanahan and others, whose use of geomorphological, isotopic, and geochemical evidence from the sediments of Lake Bosumtwi in Ghana reveals a sharp drop in the lake level between 1400 and 1850 CE due to a series of hemispheric multi-year droughts. This period correlated to the cooler temperatures in the northern hemisphere, from which the term Little Ice Age was coined. Amanda Logan, my colleague at Northwestern University, has done archaeobotanical work in the woodland savanna of central Ghana, which confirmed that this period of stress also was marked by decreased precipitation in the form of multi-decadal drought between the 15th and 17th centuries. She describes what she observed in the archaeobotanical record of central Ghana as the worst cumulative effects of drought since 300 AD. The palynological evidence that we have accumulated as well now in the metropolis of the Oyo Empire by my colleague Mobosa Orijeme and myself shows signatures of erratic rainfall and intensely dry conditions during the 15th through 13th centuries. Now it's difficult to read this if you're not in this business. So basically, so what you see here is the increase in grass foliage. So that increase correlated to about towards the end of 14th century, and that continues. But then on the other side, you see the decline in the polling of rainforest vegetation. So we now have multiple lines of evidence showing that across West Africa, there were dry conditions, low precipitation, okay? When we add these to several documentary and oral sources of intensified drought in the late 14th century, lasting through the early 16th century, we can be confident that the majority of West African peoples lived through several phases of ecological distress during this period. This hemispheric crisis abated in the early 17th century, but the ecological instability continued. I mean, you continue to see spikes of drought all the way through the middle of the 19th century. Now, let me now go back to Oyo itself in the context of this West African crisis. The Western Lower Niger, where the Oyo Empire emerged, was dominated during the West African, what I call the West African Classical Age, by Ile-Ife. This city, Ile-Ife, was the emporium the metropolis, the intellectual and political economic center of Western Lower Niger. It was also the capital of the Ife Empire. Its commercial and political networks, this empire stretched from Benin City to River Niger and all the way to Niger Bend, Mali Empire, as well as possibly Lake Chad, where Kanem Empire was. But this regional integration began to unravel around 1380, and by 1420, the ancient city was only a shell of itself. And in fact, the empire as a political entity died by 1420, and the entire Yoruba world was in disarray. I've argued that this crisis stemmed from one, political intrigues in the metropolis, as well as in the frontiers of the empire. It stemmed from the onset of cyclical episodes of severe drought at the subcontinental level. But there's another source of stress that was affecting the entire region of Western Lower Niger. And this external stress came from two sources. One was the Nupe Hausa Kanem axis, right here. And then the other one, let me see. It's clear. Yeah. And the other one is from Songe Empire itself. Okay. So let me talk about the Nupe Hausa Kanem axis. As political instability and the effects of ecological crisis were ravaging the Yoruba world, external attacks in the form of brigandage by the Nupe cavalrymen began to cross River Niger into the Yoruba country. What are they looking for? They were looking for captives. The captives were being sold primarily to Central Sudan, to Hausa territories. As a result, many Yoruba communities and kingdoms from River Mushi to the Niger-Benue confluence, that region was depopulated and evacuated. The Nupe brigandage was not an isolated local event. It was directly connected to the political and economic troubles in Central Sudan, as well as Western Sudan. In fact, to the subcontinental ecological crisis in the Sahel. The cumulative effects of the drought in the Sahel caused massive migrations towards the more ecologically stable South Lake Chad and the Hausa, what we now call Hausa region. As a result, some of the trans-Saharan trade termini were relocated, to what we call Central Sudan today. These demographic and trade route changes benefited the Hausa towns, Hausa states. According to Paul Lovejoy, Kano, Katsina, Gobir, Kebbi, and Zazzau, they grew larger with military conquest, commercial expansion, and immigration. End of quote. These places became the hub of commercial and agricultural production around 1475. Their political power rested on the use of cavalry. With their war captives, they established slave colonies to work the land and the industries, especially the indigo as well as iron production. These states relied on Kanem Bonu for their supply of horses. However, the intensive agricultural plantations that were developing in the last quarter of the 15th century in Central Sudan require more labor than the local population could supply. Therefore, the Hausa city-states and the reconstituted Kanem Bonu Empire, they looked further south for labor outside their political influence. The most important exports that the Hausa traders offered in exchange for slaves were horses. The Nupe warlords spearheaded this forced recruitment and exchange. They traded captives from the neighboring regions, including the Kemberi, the northern Yoruba, and parts of Ibariba for the Hausa horses. Some of the captives were used domestically in Central Sudan, while others were sold to other parts of the Sudan and across the Sahara. The impetus for the development and expansion of plantation slavery in Central Sudan, I will argue, might have had something to do with the inadequate, the unstable climatic regime. So basically, they were producing food, hedging their bed against periods of low precipitation. Located near the River Niger and River Mushi Junction, the Oyo Kingdom was one of the early casualties of these Nupe brigandage activities. The assault by Nupe cavalry warriors led to the evacuation of the kingdom in the middle of the 15th century. As a result of that, the leaders of Oyo migrated further south to the town we call Igboho today, as you can see on the map. The second source of the crisis came from the Songhai Empire. The fact that the political chieftains of Gao under Sunni Ali spearheaded the rise of Songhai around 1450 should be seen as a process and an act of recovery for the Songhai people. After all, it was a liberation from Mali Empire's domination since 1324, when Mansa Musa brought Gao under its control. But Songhai soon became a major source of instability in West Africa during the 15th and 16th centuries due to these four reasons. Number one, Songhai's incessant bloody succession disputes and seemingly endless internal strife between different factions of the elite affected all its southern neighbors. Many of the refugees from these wars in Songhai Empire migrated southwards into Ibariba and Musi territories. Number two, there was also Songhai's relentless aggression toward its neighbors, especially the Musi and the Ibariba in the south and Hausa in the east, in their own quest for territorial expansion and recruiting of captives to feed the empire's massive agricultural production. So slavery was also used for governance. I mean, the first eunuch system of slavery, actually, of governance, took place in West Africa in Songhai Empire. So all of this caused significant upheaval north and south of the River Niger. Number three, the Islamization of social life and government initiated by Askia Mohammed in 1493 unleashed a bloodbath between the Songhai Muslims and Songhai non-Muslims. We are familiar with the story between Sunni Ali and Askia Mohammed. Thousands of Songhai exiles, therefore, were expelled. And again, they moved southward into Musi, Ibariba, and Yoruba territories. Number four, the Islamization project under the Askias of Songhai castigated non-Muslims as fair game for conquest and enslavement. These are encoded in the literature of governance in Songhai. And Askia Mohammed made this case when he attacked the Musi, and whose leader refused to convert to Islam. Not only did he kill many of them, he enslaved their children. Of course, he waged similar war of conquest, forced conversion, and enslavement against Busa and Katsina. A question that has been missing in the historiography is how Songhai's neighbors, the Musi, the Ibariba, and Northern Yoruba, how did they respond to this Islamization project and ideology of enslavement? We have talked a lot about Al-Bagili, Ahmad Baba, and other ulamas in Timbuktu about the ideology of who is supposed to be a slave, who cannot be a slave, but we have not really talked about how did these neighbors who have actually interacted for more than 600 years, suddenly they were now being referred to as people who are outside the common humanity. How did they respond to these dialogues happening in the 15th and 16th centuries? So on top of the political instability in Western Sudan, many Bariba and the Musi were also being displaced by ecological crisis of the Little Ice Age. Prominent among these were the Bariba elephant hunters, who had penetrated the woodlands of the Yoruba-speaking region and settled among various Yoruba peoples. The political and ecological instability had created several multi-ethnic and multilingual settlements in this shaded area. Up to today, you have oral traditions talking about multilingual, multicultural interactions going back to this period, at least 1500. So this area was occupied by refugees from war, refugees from ecological distress, opportunist warriors, itinerant merchants, elephant ivory hunters, and of course, displaced monarchs and chieftains. So they were all converging in this area as early as 1470. Now, for this particular story I'm telling you, one particular place that is important for me is Igbo, because this is where the Oyo chieftains settled with their Ibariba compatriots. From their base in Igbo, the Oyo monarchs built arguably the first and largest regional and multi-ethnic political military coalition in West African history. The coalition included the Musi, Ibariba, Wangarawa, the Mande merchants, Wansandali, the Ibariba military aristocrats, and the Jama, a branch of the Songe, who I suspect now, I'm not speculating, I suspect the Jama, they were actually the Sunni Ali people who have been expelled from Songhai. The members of each group had different priorities and different motives. And they played different roles in the coalition. Some were independent mercenaries and merchants, and others were state-sponsored. But all of them were nursing wounds from either the Nupe brigandage or the Songhai expansionist program and Islamization policy. However, the Oyo built this coalition primarily to expel Nupe from their homeland and to rebuild their kingdom. The coalition began to downgrade Nupe's militaries. We don't know actually the sequence of the wars that were fought in this period, especially between 1550 and 1570. But we do know that this coalition began to downgrade Nupe's militarist power in a series of battles fought in the mid-16th century, and by 1570, Nupe was brought under the control of Oyo. This success marked the beginning of Oyo's recovery from the 150-year political instability in this region. The coalition consolidated their military gains by establishing a new capital at Oyo-Ile, where you have that red dot. And with this, they laid the foundation for what will become the Oyo Empire, what I call the West Africa's largest political formation, south of the River Niger, between 1650 and 1817. So this period now began. So now this marked the beginning of recovery for Oyo and many of his allies. The establishment of Oyo-Ile consolidated the northern thrust of Oyo's military victories and laid the groundwork for his southward expansionist program. Previous scholars have assumed that Oyo-Ile grew organically in an evolutionary sequence from the 9th century, abandoned in the 15th century, reoccupied in the late 16th century, from when it grew into a formidable city in 1630. My research shows that this assumption is inaccurate. Oyo-Ile, what became Oyo-Ile, was a late 16th century incursion onto a landscape occupied by Atokuta people. Atokuta people here. Now, the name Atokuta is my invention. We don't know the language the people spoke. We don't know what they called themselves. But the archaeological signatures are here. It includes dispersed and randomly distributed homesteads, such as those green buttons you are seeing on the screen. These are homesteads. These are very small, at best, tiny villages, just scattered all over the landscape. We also know that they built stone arrangements like the one you see in the middle with flatly laid crusher pavements. The Atokuta people lived on this landscape from about the 12th century. But between 1570 and 1600, this community had disappeared. They are totally, so we don't see continuation of any building taking place. They disappeared. And then they were replaced. The archaeological signatures were replaced by what you see on this other side. Big towns. And of course, the city right in the middle there, right? So the settlement landscape changed drastically, just within about 30 years. So from here, Oyo grew to become one of the largest cities in West Africa, with about 100,000 people living there by 1776. I suspect that a section, then, based on fragments of information from other traditions, that a section of the indigenous Atukuta people, we don't even know the language they spoke, but I would suspect that they were part of the Voltaic-speaking people of West Africa. So there are indications that a section of the indigenous Atukuta people were forcefully relocated to Oyo, where the majority of them were constituted into one lineage that later became a Alakmini lineage. And this is the lineage that is devoted to the worship of the ancestors. So that, yes, they were expelled, but basically they were reconstituted into the landscape. Thank you. Many non-Yoruba leaders of the coalition, especially the Mosi as well as the Bariba, they were also rewarded for this liberation. The office of Bashorun, for example, the second most important title in the empire, was given to the Bariba and the Mosi. So these ethnic groups, members of that group, became Oyo citizens. And by extension, they assumed Yoruba identity as well. So again, when we talk about ethnic identity in Africa, we've talked about this many times, how not only fluid, but people make things up along the as they go. So these people became Yoruba, but they still retained in their oral tradition their Bariba and Mosi ancestry up to today. And you can see that on their facial marks. They carry this passport on their faces up to today for those who still use facial marks. For example, the Gombo facial mark among the Oyo people, it has Mosi and Songa origins. Other facial marks such as Mande, I say Mande, that's already clear. Jangbade. These are also originally non-Yoruba facial marks that are not part of Oyo facial repertoire of facial identities. Now, the context, I'm going to kind of change the gear a little bit here. The context of the extreme weather in which Oyo was born shaped the worldview of his people. The 150 years of ecological instability, characterized by dry climate, hot air, and low precipitation, meant that what used to be woodland savanna became drier and more open. This also means that the people were exposed to an increased risk of death and fire incidents from dry lightning due to a combination of dry fuels, low relative humidity, and breezy conditions, especially at the base of the hills, which these new towns prefer to settle. So anywhere you see Oyo towns in this period, they were always located at the base of the hills for security purpose. I mean, there was also an increased threat of intense hurricanes and flash flooding as well. So this extreme weather experience has strong imprints in the Yoruba Orisha archive. So when we turn to Orisha archive, we begin to see, especially in Shango, the patron deity of the Oyo Empire. See, Shango himself is the personification of thunder and lightning. And his chief wife, Oya, personifies wind. I'm reading this as an historian. I'm not as an ethnographer. I'm reading the moment when these attributes developed and why a deity devoted to thunder, to lightning, to wind became so central to Oyo ritual field. Thunder, lightning, and forceful wind are three of the physical elements that define the Little Ice Age era in tropical West Africa. It is instructive that these attributes are personified by the two most important deities in the Oyo Empire, Shango and Oya. In Yoruba myth history, Shango is a hot-tempered, fire-breathing magician warrior king, and his chief wife, Oya, personifies the fiery tornado. Where Shango appears, Oya must also show up, of course. You have thunder and lightning and wind working together here. I argue that these two personalities have strong provenance in the extreme weather of the Little Ice Age. The king of Oyo, the Alaafin, not only embodies the energy of Shango, but is also the son and manifestation of Shango on the throne. The Shango ritual field is under the purview of the king and was the governing mechanism for the empire. That is, Shango priests and priestesses were the instruments for governing and establishing Alaafin's sovereignty over the empire and controlling the fiery temper of the extreme weather and ensuring rainfall, fertility of the soil, and bounty agricultural harvest was one of the sacred duties of the Alaafin. The panegyric of Shango is a rich reference to this experience of extreme weather and its instability. And I'm not going to read all of this, but you can just pick some few things there. The king who cracks the wall, dust and dust again in the dry season. Every inch of ground like marshy farm soil in the wet season. The lightning that causes the sky to tremble and to lighten, whose nature is hostility. So on and on and on. We find this reference to extreme weather in the panegyric of Shango and Oya. So when Oyo was established, of course, people were still experiencing these erratic weather patterns. Water was still a challenge to these people. So how do you have a city that will not have a dependable source of water? Not only for people, but also for their large number of animals, cattle, horses. The unpredictable year-round supply of water posed a challenge to the new metropolis. The architects of Oyo were, however, up to the task. They introduced innovations in water management and hydraulic engineering that enabled them to cope with the problem. Our landscape archaeological survey has revealed that underground rain-fed water from the hilltops, was diverted to the city and the nearby towns to serve the needs of the urban population. Terraces, artificial ponds, waterways were built to move water into the desired areas. As a result, seasonal swamps were created, some of which served as watering sites for animals during the dry season and farmlands during the rainy season. So when I told the king of Oyo, the current king of Oyo, about 2 years ago that your ancestors were water engineers, he said, look at me, sir. What do you mean? Engineers? Yeah, they were actually doing a lot of water engineering at this time. When Oyo and his allies were fighting for their survival and reclaiming their lost territories, the Atlantic coast of West Africa was already welcoming new visitors who offered new commercial opportunities. The new visitors, especially the Portuguese and later joined by the Dutch, the English, the German traders, they exchanged brass bracelets, and copper rods, Mediterranean glass beads, cowries, Indian textiles for West African elephant tusks, pepper, and Yoruba glass beads, and dyed cotton textiles. Now, Oyo needed economic connection with this new center of commerce in order to survive. So, to take advantage of this new economic opportunity, the Oyo elite prioritized their territorial expansion towards the coast in the first quarter of the 17th century. This elite saw the new coastal market as an asset for economic recovery. And plugging their new political formation into this new commercial opportunity preoccupied their expansionist policy. That policy privileged 4 strategies. 1, establishing colonies. All those red buttons, these were colonies of Oyo Empire towards the coast. Creating client polities, reducing autonomous political entities into vassal provinces, and setting up turnpike stations on high traffic trade routes. But by the time the Oyo arrived on the coast around 1630, human captives had become the dominant export commodities, not woven cotton cloth, not ivory, and not paper. But this did not deter the Oyo political elite. The captains of the empire took advantage of the winds of commercial revolution blowing inland from the coast. They financed external trade with war captives, human tributes from the provinces, and enslaved people brought from their northern neighbors. Now, there's a reverse. Before, in the 15th century, 16th century, they were going to the north. Now, people from the north were coming in, the Kanuri, the Hausa, and the Nupe. They set up trading and manufacturing houses across the empire and recruited their family members, enslaved people, and other dependents to manage these business ventures. The commercial opportunity also encouraged individuals to strike out on their own as traders, sometimes independent of familiar networks. The desire to control trade routes, gain access to diverse raw materials, agricultural land, labor, talents, and tributes motivated the Oyo expansionist project. Cavalry made the swift territorial expansion of Oyo possible, stretching from the woodland savanna and River Niger in the north to the rainforest and sand beaches of the Atlantic coast. However, we suspect that the 15th and early 16th century droughts significantly expanded the savanna ecological range deep into what used to be rainforest vegetation. So this ecology was healthy for housekeeping and ideal for cavalry warfare. I will argue that the effects of the Little Ice Age actually also aided Oyo's military expansion because they were able to move their horses into areas where horses would not have been able to survive before. So Oyo employed many strategies for achieving its territorial expansion, including warfare and diplomacy. But the most stable and sustainable of all was colonization. So as we talk about the history of the early modern period, colonization, we should also think about how other peoples in West Africa, especially, how they were practicing colonization at this time. Of course, I will not go to the extent that their colonization was not one of decimating, destroying the indigenous people they met along the way. It's a different ballgame entirely, but it's a very similar strategy. In ideological and material terms, these Oyo colonies were transplantations of the metropolis in the frontiers of the empire. Over the next 200 years, they enabled the metropolis to access a diversified range of resources and to redistribute the population from the savanna area to the southern rainforest. These colonies also gave Oyo strong leverage for controlling trade routes and governing the conquered territories. Our archaeological work in one of these colonies called Edeile, which I started this work in 2004, and I cannot believe I'm still working there. I left and then I'm back. This work has shown us how the imperial agents manipulated the landscape to establish, project, and consolidate their power in what was initially a hostile anti-imperial environment. They in fact changed the rainforest environment of Edeile by introducing savanna plants and animals such as baobab trees, horses, and donkeys. The result was that they created a savanna landscape in a rainforest ecological zone. The remains of horses that we find in this site accounted for 40% of the remains of domesticated animals. Horses were the backbone of the empire. They were also the most expensive property. They were the Lamborghini, the Ferrari, and the Pagani and Rolls Royce of the time. Only the political chieftains and the richest merchants could afford to own horses. And to maintain its military advantage over its neighbors, Oyo needed thousands of these horses in the metropolis as well as in the colonies. They were purchased mostly from their northern, central, and western Sudanese neighbors. To put things in perspective, the price of a healthy horse in Oyo in 1826 was between 80,000 and 100,000 cowries. That was the price for two healthy, enslaved, young adult men. So you can see how that one horse worth more than one individual in 1826. Therefore, horses were the most expensive item in the empire's budget. But this is not where the expense ended. Horses require an enormous amount of care. Watering these horses 2 or 3 times a day, at least, right? So it could take up to 4 individuals working full time to maintain one horse, according to the estimate by Robin Law. So, and of course, this includes veterinarians and many other people who are to maintain the health of the horses. What is interesting, however, is that the caretakers, that work, that difficult work of taking care of horses was given to this enslaved population. The citizens of Oyo, they don't touch it. In fact, so that taking care of horses was like a mark of bondage, of slavery. Again, human beings can be very funny. You are putting the future, physically, the safety of the empire in the hands of the enslaved population, who they consider to be members of their household. That's another topic for another day. The West African region already faced labor crisis at the onset of the literacy, especially starting in the mid-15th century. Because this is another dimension of my talk that I think is important for us to take note of it, that labor shortage was already present. And when the empire now had to retain the labor of so many individuals to maintain horses, for political administration, it means that they have to recruit more slaves to take care of the actual economic production. Farming, making pottery, making iron. So Oyo plugged itself into this slave economy, in part because there was a reverse of the supply route at the onset of the Oyo Empire period. As I said before, instead of the Nupe moving the enslaved Yoruba to Central Sudan, the people of Central Sudan were now being sent to the coast via Oyo. So the empire also relied on its northern neighbors for the labor needed to support its expanding state bureaucracies and the market. David Antis and Paul Lovejoy and others have estimated that cumulatively between 1630 and 1830 in the Port of Benin, for every one enslaved adult man sold to the Middle Passage, 2 enslaved adult women were retained domestically. The political and military elite, and later those in the middle class, benefited from this retention of enslaved women. From that population, they recruited wives for themselves, their sons, and other male dependents. This development provided the political elite, the merchants, and the war captains the opportunity to bypass the traditional and more expensive marriage contract, as I said yesterday in this class. Instead, they used a large number of female slaves as wives to increase the sizes of their household, domestic labor, and economic production. In order to maximize labor, the state intervened in changing the gender identity of thousands of people and made reproductive choices for them. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. To circumvent the Yoruba principles of gender division of labor, the Oyo Palace had the sole prerogative to change the gender identities of its dependents, especially the enslaved population. In these politically and economically motivated endeavors, some biological women became social males, and biological men became social females. Also, thousands of enslaved men were made into eunuchs. The most prominent of these eunuchs were given their own residences to manage on behalf of the king. These compounds were populated by the king's non-conjugal wives, however, and their primary purpose was to work for the state. So now you are having eunuchs who are ceremonial husbands of women who cannot procreate, who are forbidden from having children. In fact, it was a crime for in fact, any man that was found accused of having relations with this woman is death. For the women, of course, they are not killed, but they are also served severe punishment. So Oyo began to establish these slave colonies governed by male eunuchs. Our household archaeology project in Oyo is now beginning to identify some of these residences. You see. And this is now making us to rethink the household configurations in the Oyo Empire. This chart is very complicated, I understand, but just I've classified Oyo residential configuration into 2 parts. We have household that we can call Ajogbe co-residency. Another one that is called Ajobi based on kinship. Ajobi households tend to be ones that can self-reproduce itself. Ajobi may be able to reproduce itself, but sometimes they may not be able to reproduce themselves, because if you have the eunuch and with wives, that household cannot reproduce itself, right? So you begin to see households that were state dependent and those that were autonomous, self-producing. I can talk more about this later in Q&A. Although the majority of the people with servile origins became junior members of their respective households, in this case, during their lifetime and could not be sold, by the end of the 18th century, social mobility was increasingly becoming difficult for those on the lower rungs of the social ladder, including the enslaved and the underclass citizens. This was the result of the dwindling economic fortunes of the empire, increasing population, and poor harvest due to exhausted farmlands, and of course, the return of the frequent episodes of drought at the very end of the lingering Little Ice Age between 1780 and 1830s. The social impact of these economic and ecological stresses worsened with the rise of abuse by the desperate elite seeking to make up for the shortfalls in their economic fortunes. All of this made the poor restless and resentful. In 1817, a large segment of the enslaved and the citizen underclass in the capital revolted and fought their way out of the city to join a growing anti-metropolitan resistance that already established its base in Ilorin, which is another colony of the empire, 60 kilometers south of Oyo. The quest for freedom from bondage and arbitrary power, aided by the wind of the jihadist revolution blowing from central Sudan, and the intra-elite conflict in the metropolis was an important reason for this slave underclass revolt. However, the immediate catalyst for it may have been the shortage of food and intense hunger in the capital due to the spike in the incidences of drought between 1801 and 1817. In order to understand the context of this revolt at a micro scale, we have been investigating the everyday lives of and the living conditions of the underclass, who are also dependents of the state. These are the kind of people likely to have joined the 1817 revolt. We have focused our attention on Bara, which was one of the satellite towns, about 2 to 4 kilometers from Oyo. Bara was one of the most important towns in the metropolitan area because the kings of Oyo were supposedly buried there. Many of the palace officials who served each king during his lifetime were relocated to Bara, where they lived in a state-sponsored monastery-like arrangement. A significant number of these men and women were wives, slaves, and other royal dependents. They were banished to Bara to serve the needs of the deceased king for the rest of their lives. We have excavated several residential, We have excavated several residential structures where these dependents lived. Through the material life, we hope to shed light on the political economy of the empire and the circumstances that culminated in the 1870s revolt. Our initial observations are the unfree people lived in barrack-like longhouses, like the one you are seeing here. The material poverty of these residences is glaring. But the food remains that they ate, of course, included horses, which Oyo sumptuary law only allowed the elite to eat. So how did they get horses? We can only, we suspect that since they received food grants from the state, so their dietary, will also reflect some of the diet of the elite. So that's why we have horses, cattle among their food remains. But what is striking is that serving wares are very, very scarce in this area, showing that the kind of food service that a regular community or a regular household will have been accustomed to was not part of their material culture. So they will have been served in perishable containers like calabash, like leaves, because they were receiving food ration from the state. As I now bring to my talk to conclusion, resistance to Islamization and creative solutions to drought laid the groundwork for your recovery around 1570. Yet, a new Islamic theocracy in Central Sudan and the hunger and social disaffection from the long tail of the Little Ice Age were also the catalysts of the 1817 revolt in the capital. The empire never recovered from the consequences of that revolt. For the next 19 years, the empire and the metropolis withered in size and power. In the dry season of 1836, the king of Oyo, with the support of 3 Ibariba kings, took their offense to the rebels, now backed by the Fulani jihadists. The victory that the Oyo and the Ibariba ancestors recorded in the mid 16th century might have boosted their confidence and morale. However, the outcome was different. They lost the war. All the 4 kings died. The metropolis was deserted, and the empire was no more. The concept of recovery remains an exploratory project in my study of the Oyo Empire. It allows me to reflect on how past societies dealt with crisis and to assess the nature of their vulnerability and resilience. Recovery in everyday language use tends to be about the process and event of departure from the past and arrival in a new condition, the present. But it does more than this. It offers a rich conceptual tool for analyzing what happened after disruption, shock, and instability. Recovery signals a new consciousness, and it may refer to wellness, healing, renewal, restoration, regeneration, and rebuilding. But one of the lessons of history is that what is lost is never fully recovered as it was originally. Depending on the eyes of the beholder, recovery may be better than what preceded it, or fall short of what was lost. With recovery, a new ontology, epistemology, and value system may be needed to cope with and overcome the challenges presented by the preceding crisis. In some ways, recovery offers the opportunity to refashion the society. The lesson from the Oyo Empire is that what we recover from doesn't always go away. It can come back again and again. We must therefore evaluate not only why and how societies are born, but how and why they get sick, recover, and go sick again. Maybe sometimes never to recover again. Thank you for listening.
If any of you, we realize it's 1 o'clock, so if any of you need to leave, feel free to
My apologies for